The Elder Scrolls Online has another big update planned for this year. As they do pretty much every single year, they'll be releasing a few small DLCs. That includes dungeons and some story content, one of which is already out, along with one major chapter update that adds an entirely new playable area and a bunch of other stuff. Now, this entire year's worth of content is called the Legacy of the Bretons, and the next major chapter is called High Isle. So we know we're going to be getting a brand new zone. These are the islands of High Isle, Aminos, and then some smaller island locations. There will be new world events, the delves, the public dungeons, world bosses, standalone quests. There are these new events called fissures, which take the place of dolmens in the base game. There'll be, of course, a new main story quest line that's all about and follows some intrigue and mystery behind the Legacy of the Bretons. There's also a new in-game collectible card game called Tales of Tribute. There will be a new 12-player trial, Dreadsail Reef, the addition of 2 new companions, and various other updates and quality of life improvements. Now, I got access to a preview build. I've had a chance to play several hours now, and I want to share with you and talk a bit about what I saw. Now, unfortunately, we weren't allowed to capture any of this build. There was no screen recording allowed, so I can't show you any of my actual gameplay, but I do have some B-roll that I can use that does include a lot of the new stuff, so I'll just run that as well as some stock ESO trailer footage and stuff in the background. It's not exactly ideal, but I at least wanted to share with you what I saw because I can describe the things. But yeah, let's just jump in and talk a bit about what is High Isle, what's coming in this update, and everything that I saw in the time that I've played. So because these were on special preview servers, they actually gave us access to these max level accounts with full champion points. So these were pretty powerful characters. I had access to basically whatever gear that I wanted to use. And so I made my early character, and then we just started off by spawning into what is the initial major town in High Isle. It's called Gonfalon Bay. It's like this medieval themed port city. All of the buildings here are made out of wood and stone. And there was a whole bunch of characters, various NPC vendors, buildings we could go into. There was a bunch of drunken NPCs stumbling around with people complaining about them stealing all the grog, which was kind of funny. But right after spawning, the main quest NPC was standing just in front of me, and I spoke with him and then began this quest line. I had to investigate what was happening at the lighthouse, and then eventually had to find this stolen idol. I went through the first 1 or 2 quests, and then I quickly realized this isn't really what I wanted to do with my time playing the preview build, so I instead decided to just head out into the open world and explore the map. This has always been kind of one of my favorite aspects of ESO in the past. It's just checking out the different locations, seeing the Elder Scrolls theming and areas, seeing the landmarks, and participating in the different events. Now, almost immediately when I went out exploring, I came across a volcanic event, and this is the new public event similar to the Dolmen Daedra invasions from the base ESO, if you played it back when it launched or at any point in the past several years. Now, this iteration are essentially these volcanic fissures that are erupting from the ground, and then there's some sort of druid trying to keep it closed. So you have to help them in closing the eruption by killing all of these enemies. There's a ton of AoE explosions as you have to dodge lava that's spewing out of these events, and then also you'll be killing various Daedric enemies. There are familiars, Atronachs, these massive lizard creatures, and you do this for long enough time, you kill enough creatures, eventually a boss spawns and you have to kill that. And I actually saw various types of bosses. It wasn't just the same kind, but various Daedric bosses, Atronachs, lizards. And then once you complete it all and you kill the boss, the druid closes the vents, the eruptions stop, and you get your reward. And it's actually this volcanic node that you have to mine, and then out pops some items like crafting materials and loot. It's kind of weird because, it's a different presentation, but it's pretty much the same as the Dolmen invasions. It's pretty straightforward. Bunch of enemies come, you kill them, you kill a boss, you collect your reward, and that is essentially it. This one's just themed differently because instead of Daedric chains falling from the sky, it's just creatures spawning in and a volcano erupting. So I left there and I kept exploring until I found my first delve. This place was called Breakwater Cave. Just outside of the entrance was this NPC who had a quest for me that he wanted me to search for his lost sheep. I accepted the quest. I went inside and it was cool. It was like this seaside cavern. It was filled with these bioluminescent plants and it really had this vibe of having been underwater at one point. There was seaweed everywhere, these giant petrified mushrooms and other plants and stuff. There were pools of water all over the place. And in terms of creatures, there were like imps, these vipers, and then these kind of hybrid aquatic creatures, bipedal crustaceans, and this thing that looks like a mix between a lizard and a turtle, which was kind of cool. So I just explored around the inside a bit. I really like the delves. Going through these dungeons and just taking my time and checking it out is fun. One of the aspects of ESO I really like doing. I progressed the quest. Eventually, I reached the delve boss, which was called Brine Claw. It was just an elite version of those bipedal crustacean creatures. Also inside were Sky Shard. Those are usually in delves, as well as all sorts of lootable containers. So I left the delve, I went out, and I actually found a second volcanic vent. There were several of these scattered all around the main high isle, which I should mention, I did spawn into High Isle proper. It's like it's the largest of the new bit of playable content. It's this big circular island with this little tiny island located right in the middle as well. But I was on the massive circular area, which as far as I can tell is the largest play space of all of the new stuff that is coming in with this update. But yeah, I found another volcanic vent. I did the same thing. I killed all of the creatures and then the druid closed the vent and I collected my reward. There was all sorts of other interesting landmarks and points of interest that I discovered, such as this druid's gate. There were these stone ruins with this massive stone structures surrounding an altar with candles on it. Points of interest like the Spriggan's Crown, foresty area kind of propped up out of nowhere with Spriggans all around. I also found a crafting spot called the Steadfast Hammer and Saw, and this is where you could build the Order's Wrath set, which gives you bonuses to crit chance, weapon and spell damage, and then the 5-piece set increases your crit damage and crit healing by X%. Kept on exploring, and eventually I came across my first overworld boss, and these things are really cool because, yeah, they can be quite difficult. This was called the Sable Knight. He was sitting inside of a large overgrown stone arena, and he's just this large armored skeleton knight who is wielding a mason shield, and he was like all magical glowy. And this was a quite a difficult encounter. He had a few interesting attacks, like he could launch out his shield kind of Captain America style. He also would cast this AoE fear ability, and with him at all times is a posse of elite skeletons. There was a knight, archer, healer, and assassin, and if you killed one of these companions, the boss could just then resurrect them instantly. So kind of was a pain. The fight took me about 6 minutes or so in total. I kind of got lousy rewards, but it was a fun encounter and one of the few bits of challenging content that I saw while I was playing. Kept on exploring. I found places like the Steadfast Manor, which had a side quest to investigate while the patients kept getting sick, and just more typical ESO open world stuff. There were more delves, various locations that had side quests, more points of interest, a few more world bosses, and several other volcanic events scattered all around the main island. Now, eventually, I ended up finding the public dungeon on High Isle. This is one of all, there's a lot of things I like about ESO, but also kind of like the delves and the world bosses. I've always really loved the public dungeons because they can be quite a bit of a challenge for someone like myself who spends a lot of time playing solo. It's cool to go in there and be met with some difficulty while you're just playing. It's a nice contrast to the ease of the overworld. Public dungeon was called the Spire of the Crimson Coin. I actually had to take a boat in order to enter it. There was a boat on the side of the main High Isle, and interacting with the boat kind of teleported me to the public dungeon. What was it like? Well, it was just this massive island castle enshrouded in mist, and inside were a ton of undead creatures, mercenaries, and like public dungeons, several bosses for you to engage with and get loot from. Really, really love going through this. I enjoy the delves. I adore the public dungeons. If I were to rank them, that's how I'd put it. It's really cool. I like open world stuff in MMOs, and some of these things are what I've really enjoyed in ESO. So that whole process of just going around and exploring the main High Isle location and checking out all of that stuff is what I did for really a majority of my time with the preview build. Eventually, though, I went back to the initial starter city. I kept doing the main story quest, and I came across a side quest which introduced me to the card game system that they're adding with this update. So this is called Tales of Tribute, and in the main starter town, there was an NPC who gave me a quest bringing me inside of this tavern where a bunch of people were playing this card game. And I went over the basics. It was actually kind of confusing, but basically speaking, it's a card game that's not quite like maybe your standard card games. It's not really like Magic the Gathering, or it's not like Hearthstone, or it's not like Pokemon card game, or it's really not like any card game that I've played myself personally. The way it works is you've got like this shared deck that you and your opponent pull from, and then you've got a starting hand of what's essentially currency that you put down to play from that draw pile in the middle of these shared cards. And the ultimate win condition is two options. You have to build up these points, and once you reach a certain threshold, you will win, or you have to get what are called these patrons to favor you by activating their abilities, which will have some benefits but also some drawbacks. And if you can get all 4 patrons that are in a match to favor you, then you will also win. So it's a card game with 2 win conditions, but it's not about like attacking your opponent and reducing their health. That's not what it is. It's quite interesting. I didn't get a ton of time with this, unfortunately, though, because everything wasn't quite implemented. They told us when they gave us access to this preview build that it's quite an older build. A ton of assets weren't in. It seemed like a ton of the instructional stuff wasn't in. The features didn't seem to be quite working properly. But fundamentally, I just think it's cool in that it's unique from any sort of card game that I've played before. So this is definitely something that once the full build is out on the public test server and once it fully launches and I can play some more, I am looking forward to diving in to kind of figure out a bit more what this thing is all about. So after a little bit of time checking out the Tales of Tribute card game, I went back into the overworld. I progressed the main story a little bit, and then I realized, hey, there are all these other islands in addition to the main High Isle location that I haven't seen yet. But more importantly, the second major island is this place called Aminos, and you have to take a raft to go there from High Isle. It brings you to this second big island, which is really cool. It's quite different. The first island is like a little more open, a little more sparse, I would say, in terms of like vegetation on the landscape. This was a very dense wild zone, tons of massive overgrown trees and like sheer cliffs of craggy rock. It's a smaller location than High Isle. High Isle is definitely the centerpiece, but Aminos I personally actually enjoyed quite a bit more. I just liked the environment. I liked being on this island better. I like spending time here. It was smaller though. There were a lot fewer locations and point of interest. It did have its own public dungeon, which was cool. So we're getting at least 2 new public dungeons in this update, but there were fewer volcanic vents. There were fewer delves. There were fewer I think I only saw 1 world boss actually, and fewer points of interest. So just keep in mind when they say we're getting 2 large islands, it's really 1 large island and like a medium to smaller size island is how I would say it. And a few other interesting things of note that I just saw as I was moving around and exploring the High Isles and Aminos. At one point, I was just walking along the coast of the main island, and out of nowhere, this ghost ship just appeared like right on the shore. Some ghost captain said something, and then a bunch of undead enemies were summoned in, and eventually it ended with like a mini boss, and I got some loot. That was kind of cool. Seemed like a random event that just happened as I was just walking along the coast. It was really, really neat. It literally just popped up out of nowhere. Like there was nothing, there was water, and then ghost ship and enemies spawning in. That was a cool little event to stumble across. And also something I do want to mention here, I was crashing a ton. In these 7 hours that I played, I think I had like 12 crashes total, which is quite a bit, way more than I was comfortable with. Now, again, they did tell us this was an older build, but still, how old can it be that crashes were happening that frequently? If it was just like 1 crash in my play session, I probably wouldn't have mentioned it because maybe it's just some like issue, you know, with my personal hardware. But getting 12 crashes is like that. There was clearly something going on. So Hopefully that is fixed by the time this starts to go public, right? And then overall, if I were to just wrap up, you know, how am I feeling about this update after spending some time with it? I don't know, it's more Elder Scrolls Online in just about every way. Like all of the overworld stuff that you expect if you've ever played ESO, there is just more of it. More delves, more public dungeons, more points of interest, more crafting stations, groups of NPCs in 1 to 2 to 3 all over the place at these different locations. Again, there are the new public events called the Volcanic Vents. They're basically just dolmens in my eye with a new coat of paint. It's essentially the same thing. It's like the base public event type that they've had for, I don't know, how long has this game been out? Eight or so years now. So it doesn't really feel new or unique. It just looks a little bit different. And I do want to say, just generally speaking, I just feel like the setting and theming of this update is just less interesting to me personally. Some of the prior updates, like when they revisited parts of Skyrim and the Morrowind update that we've gotten over these past couple of years, are way more interesting, and I feel like they're way more engaging play spaces to be in. The main part of High Isle was just kind of bland feeling to me. I'm hoping though that maybe that's also a consequence of this me having played a older build, and when the full version comes out, it'll be more fleshed out and more interesting. I don't know. I did really like the second smaller island though, Aminos. I thought that was a really cool location, but the general tone, the vibe, the setting, the theming of this whole High Isle update, it isn't quite hooking me as much as some of their prior updates. That doesn't mean it's bad necessarily. It just means that it's less interesting than some of the stuff they've done in the past, and even to me than like base ESO, right? This update is it's just more of it, which is cool for an MMO. It's cool to be getting more stuff. That's something. And all of that said, I am really looking forward to diving into more. If nothing else, spending several hours on this preview server reminded me I enjoy playing ESO, and there's still plenty for me to see. I haven't checked out the 12-player trial. I haven't tried any of the new dungeons. I haven't really checked out the companion stuff, but that's mainly because I don't really care to play with companions. I prefer to solo, but that's a whole system that I still really need to spend some time with. And while one of my biggest complaints about ESO remains true, just the base overworld combat is so simple. Pretty much everything gets just like 1 or 2 shot. Really wish that they would add more challenge to it. I mean, you've got all these enemies with all these different attacks and abilities and animations that you like never end up seeing because everything in the overworld dies in 1 or 2 hits. So that's something I hope they address in the future, but that's kind of a separate complaint from this update. I liked it generally, and it reminded me, if nothing else, that I do want to play some more ESO, and I will be playing some more ESO. So expect some more coverage from of this update and of the game in general from me in the not too distant future. But that's going to do it for this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you in the next one. Take it easy.